Hello, everyone. I'm Steve Greenhouse. Welcome to the session on COVID-19, school districts and teachers unions and how they fared. We have four excellent panelists today, and I'm asking each of them to speak for 7-8 minutes. Then we'll have some conversation, and then we'll take your questions and answers. Please do that through chat. Ever since COVID-19 arrived on America's shores early last year, it has rocked our nation's education system and created a profoundly difficult time for our public schools, our 50 million public school students, for school districts, for school boards, for teachers unions, for parents and students. There have been fierce arguments about whether schools should remain open or closed, about whether some governors and school boards were way too quick to order that schools be open 5 days a week. Some people criticize teachers unions for pushing too hard against resuming in-school, in-person classes. We've all read numerous articles about how difficult it has been for many students doing remote learning, and we all sympathize for them. I could hold forth at length on all this, but we're lucky we do have four excellent panelists today. They will shed some light on the pressures and cross-cutting issues faced by so many school boards and teachers unions and parents and students. The first speaker will be Becky Pringle. She's the president of the National Education Association, the nation's largest labor union with nearly 3 million members. Pringle was long a middle school teacher, having spent 31 years in the classroom. Before she assumed the union's top post last year, Pringle served as NEA vice president, and before that as the NEA secretary treasurer. She directed the NEA's work to combat institutional racism and spotlight systemic patterns of racism and educational injustice that impact students. Next, after her will be Ana Maria Chavez. She's the executive director and CEO of the National School Boards Association, which represents state school boards associations and their locally elected school board members in all 50 states. She was previously executive vice president for the National Council on Aging, and from 2011 to 2016, she was CEO of Girl Scouts of the USA, the first woman of color to lead this 104-year-old group. She held numerous positions in the Clinton administration and later returned to Arizona to serve then Governor Janet Napolitano. The third speaker will be Alec McGillis, who covers politics and government for ProPublica. McGillis previously reported for the New Republic, the Washington Post, and the Baltimore Sun. He won the 2016 Robin Toner Prize for Excellence in Political Reporting and the 2017 Polk Award for National Reporting. A resident of Baltimore, a proud resident of Baltimore, he's the author of The Cynic, biography of Senator Mitch McConnell, and more recently, a terrific new book on Amazon, Fulfillment, Winning and Losing in One-Click America. The fourth speaker will be Saul Rubenstein, who's a professor of labor studies and employment relations at Rutgers and director of its Center for the Study of Collaboration in Work and Society. He focuses his research on the impact of changes in work organization on firms and unions. He also focuses on the new forms of firm governance and that have resulted from joint labor management efforts to improve industrial relations and work systems. He's co-author of the book, Learning from Saturn, Possibilities for Corporate Governance and Employee Relations. We will start with Becky Pringle. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve, for that kind and generous introduction. It's good to be here today on this illustrious panel with Ana Maria and with Alec and with my good friend Saul. I am honored to be here today representing the 3 million members of the National Education Association. As our nation moves toward a new normal, whatever that is, in our public schools, these types of conversations are absolutely critical to ensure that every one of our students, everyone, has the access and opportunity they need and they so deserve. I need to begin by saying this again and again. During the entire pandemic, no one has wanted to return to in-person learning instruction more than our educators. I've said that since the time I took the office of the presidency, and even before then. You know, the narrative that teachers somehow objected to or obstructed school reopenings or the unions that represented them is inaccurate, and it honestly has been destructive. Better than anyone else, educators know students learn best in the company of their fellow students and in face-to-face interactions with their educators. We also know that educators help to protect the safety and health and well-being of students and educators and families and communities. So the notion that there is a conflict between the health and safety of educators and that of students, you know, we've long said the working conditions of educators are the learning conditions of students. This is no different. It's just inaccurate to make that to claim that. Rather than the pandemic itself, the fact that we know infections were carried from schools by students and educators into their families and into the communities, it helps us underscore what we've been saying all year, that, you know, it's not just about the school, it's about the entire community. And so we must share that responsibility to care for that entire community, not just the part within the schoolhouse doors. You know, as a leader of this nation's largest labor union, I was proud. I've never been prouder, honestly, to be a teacher, to be an educator, to see our members, educators, all of them, bus drivers and food service workers and so many others standing in the gaps for our students when our school buildings closed. And they did everything they could do to make sure that learning continued. And not just that, they know that students can't learn if they're hungry. So you saw them going around and delivering meals. You know, before COVID hit, we knew there were students that didn't have enough to eat. We knew there were students that couldn't do their homework. We talked about, we had a coalition of over 60 organizations come together, ironically in February, right before the pandemic closed our school buildings, where we gathered together to talk about that homework gap, because we knew there were far too many students that didn't have connectivity at home. And of course, we knew there were students who didn't have a place to call home. And of course, that homelessness rate has just grown since the pandemic. We know who experiences those disparities the most. We know this. We know this. We've always known it. It's our Black and Brown and Indigenous students, and our students living in underserved and under-resourced neighborhoods. We also know those inequities are sewn up in every one of this nation's social systems. So it's not just our education system, it's our healthcare system, it's our economic system, it's our housing system, it's all of those systems, all of those inequities within those systems, they compound on our students. And the pandemic only exacerbated that. And as always, society's ills find their way to our schoolhouse doors. This heightened our responsibility as educators to protect our students, and it helped to illustrate the reason NEA is so deeply committed to the work of creating racial and social justice. Ultimately, we know that without that, we will never have education justice. As a middle school teacher for over 30 years, I am keenly aware of the immense pressure and great risks involved in making sound, safe decisions in an environment that included science that changed every day. It was almost 24 hours. It was changing so quickly. As a leader of the NEA, I was grateful to see how the collective bargaining process and other forms of advocacy came into play to keep safety as educators' top priority. This past March, I joined First Lady Jill Biden and our Education Secretary, Dr. Cardona, at Fort LaBeouf, Pennsylvania, which opened for in-person learning, which that story wasn't told. Then most of our schools were open. They opened for in-person learning back at the beginning of the school year. And they were able to open and stay open. They didn't go through all the chaos of closing and opening and shutting and outbreaks of COVID. And the reason that happened is because of authentic collaboration that Saul will talk about between the union and the school board and administrators, the community and parents. And they were able to come to an agreement. So our education support professionals were paid, even though they couldn't do the job that they would have been doing in school. They found other ways that our support professionals could help our students learn. They had health and safety standards that exceeded health department mandates. They had PPE and disinfectant equipment. They made sure they were available. They used the CARES money, the first CARES money, and they worked on their budget together so that they could have the materials they needed to keep their students safe. They could implement the social distancing guidelines that the CDC was calling for. In Wisconsin, our NEA affiliate in Racine won their grievance to get the school districts to purchase smaller masks so students, our younger students, younger than second grade, could have masks that actually fit their faces. The union took that action, and they took other actions to keep students safe, and they continue to collaborate with the district on doing building by building walkthroughs to check ventilation systems. So as educators, they are the trusted voices in the communities, they could actually help to send the message to their families that their schools were safe. We are also addressing safety through longstanding national labor management partnerships with the National School Boards Association, with the American Association of School Administrators, the American Federation of Teachers, and other national education stakeholders associations. And we're working really hard to have those partnerships mirrored at the state and at the local level. In states and districts nationwide, we are bargaining and collaborating, partnering, doing whatever it takes to keep our students and our educators and our families safe. That's not to say that the process has always been smooth. It has not. But through it all, safety has been our primary goal. It's a stance that is shared by President Biden, who has been very clear from the beginning to support our students and educators and our unions. He's been very clear. That's why his American Rescue Plan, which allocated over $170 billion, it's directly focused on education to provide the resources that we need to make and keep our schools safe. In everything we say, in everything we do all across this nation, the members of the NEA work every day to do what is safe and to do what is just and to do what is right. We know that our students are depending on us to be worthy of them. Thank you so much, and I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you very much, President Pringle. Anna Maria Chavez, thank you.
Hello, it's great to be with everybody this afternoon. Thank you, Becky, for your wonderful remarks, and I look forward to hearing from Alex and Saul. I have the pleasure and honor of being here representing a wonderful federation. It's 81 years old this year, and we represent, again, 49 state associations across the country, and who then, in turn, support our 90,000 school board members. And as you know, I always say this, I believe that school boards are actually the purest form of democracy right now. They are nonpartisan, they're volunteers, they give back every day. And over this pandemic period, clearly, they had a lot of issues they were addressing. I'm just going to, and I know we have very limited time at the very beginning of this session to give remarks. I want to focus narrowly on a few issues that at the school board level, we've been very focused on. I represent the national organization with a national board of directors who are elected, again, to raise up the issues from a local level. And clearly, as COVID-19 became this tsunami-sized challenge for our nation, we saw our families having to adjust very quickly to what we call clearly the new normal for our kids learning at home. And other families, however, were forced to choose between going to a job or staying home with their children. And so school boards across the country saw this pandemic widening the achievement and opportunity gaps. Again, as students already facing the greatest challenges were disproportionately impacted by school closure, loss of instruction time, and limited access to broadband. An analysis by McKinsey & Company finds that on average, students of color could lose 6 to 12 months of learning in math by the end of this month, compared to 4 to 8 months for white students. Now, if we can say there's a silver lining in this horrible pandemic situation, there was one. It did underscore the importance of schools and teachers to our society at large. All of a sudden, everybody became a teacher. The schoolhouse became the kitchen table. And as you know, schools not only provided instruction, they had provided a safe place for students to go while their parents were at work. They were providing meals and counseling and all these other amazing social services that in my prior life, I used to fund at the state level. And these social services were so critical to families in crisis. But today, like you, like the rest of our membership, like the 51 million children who are attending public schools, we all are praying for the end of this pandemic. We're excited that most of the country is vaccinated and then younger children are now eligible for the vaccine. But where I guess I'm focused and our membership is focused, that again, this tsunami size issue that has hit this nation and this world, when the tsunami hits, you don't see the damage until the water recedes and reveals the real destruction. In this case, we won't be confronted with destroyed buildings or landscapes. We'll be confronted with learning loss, trauma, socio-emotional needs, and lives forever changed. And for these reasons and more, I personally continue to worry about our students. Many are returning to school buildings. Many will return in the fall, but many may also continue to learn remotely over the summer. And I know that they miss seeing their teachers and their classmates. I worry about the achievement and opportunity gaps that are growing and the grades that are dropping. And we know about these challenges and see them every day, but I also worry about the things that are building inside of our students that we don't see. There are social and emotional needs. As a mother of a college student, I saw him unfortunately begin this pandemic as a senior in high school, and I saw the impact of him learning remotely in college. And I saw the stress level in him and his peers. It was horrible. But again, this stress that they feel, they unfortunately not only have the stress of having to learn remotely, but many of our children across the country had an additional stress of having to take care of their siblings while their parents went to work, or they felt that anxiety that I know many of you on this Zoom platform today felt when you try to log in, when you don't have great internet access. What happens, right? The stress of not being able to get your work done. I also worry about the estimated close to 3 million students who haven't attended school since school started back in March of 2020. Some statistics are saying that close to 25% of students in the most marginalized populations have completely missed out on learning for the past year. That's unbelievable. So COVID-19 was a shock to our system in so many ways. As Becky said, revealing long-standing challenges that have gone ignored for decades. But again, for us at NSBA, we've been very narrowly focused on ensuring, one, that the federal funding continues, that we were, again, educating congressional members, the new administration about these significant issues. And of course, for us, one of the key issues was this homework gap. It's a key component of our work because we know that when the pandemic hit, many families already equipped with fast internet connections adapted very quickly. They went online, they were able to do video chats to connect with their teachers. But for others, more than 15 million students, 15 million. Remote learning was like trying to learn from a remote island, cut off from essential information and instruction. And a disproportionate number of these students came from and come from low-income households and rural areas. These students often depended on their schools and their school libraries, their local libraries and buses, unfortunately, to bring Wi-Fi to bridge their homework gap. According to a recent report issued by the Alliance for Excellent Education, the National Indian Education Association, the National Urban League, and Unidos US, 34% of Native American students, 31% of Latino students, and 31% of Black students lack high-speed internet access, compared to 21% of white students. The report also found that 45% of households making less than $25,000 lack high-speed internet access. So as schools hopefully shift back to in-person learning this fall, a continued commitment to closing the homework gap will be essential in order to give students equitable chances to continue learning in and out of the classroom. As difficult as the pandemic was, it did force us to move faster than we would without it, unfortunately. When school buildings closed, states and school districts rushed to provide internet-connected devices. School leaders made significant changes to instructional delivery, curriculum, professional development, and more. And of course, our wonderful teachers refined their skills to deliver instruction remotely. States and districts have also had to be innovative, parking Wi-Fi equipped school buses in unconnected neighborhoods and providing hotspots to students. I actually read about one district that actually brought Wi-Fi by drones to their students. So again, now that we've seen the power of remote learning, we can't go backwards. So I will close just to say this. Yes, there are still big challenges around to make sure that every student and every teacher has access to the internet. But as the school year comes to a close, I hope we can all reflect on everything we did differently over the past year. Think about what worked, what didn't work, and what we didn't even try, and how we will use what we've learned over the past year to continue to transform education. Because innovation and funding, yes, are vital parts of reopening our school buildings safely and successfully. But it's also important that the voices of our administrators, our educators, our parents, even our students and other community stakeholders are part of the conversation, because they're all part of our collaborative partnership structure to ensure that we have a shared goal of meeting students' needs while balancing families and communities and districts and school staff's health, safety, and well-being. So thank you again for including me in this dialogue today, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you very, very much. Appreciate your remarks. Alec?
I'm going to use my funny looking headset because the cicadas are so loud here that I'm worried that it would overwhelm me. So I'll use the funny headset from 1990. Steve, thanks so much for the introduction. I'm really glad to be here with Becky and Anna-Maria and Saul. Just really quite an honor to be included in this. I'm obviously coming at this from a somewhat different vantage as a reporter. And so I'm just going to talk a little bit about my reporting on this subject and try to stick to that as much as I can. I decided to take this on last summer as a big subject because of what I saw happening around me here in Baltimore, not just with my own children who were struggling somewhat with remote learning, but with some of the boys and young men that I have been mentoring and tutoring here in town. And one boy in particular who was at the time 12 years old, who was just completely cut adrift in the spring in those first couple months of remote learning. And it was not just the problem of the internet connections that so many people talk about or the lack of equipment, because he did actually have a laptop and he usually had internet connection. The problem was just the complete lack of communication, not getting the text from teachers, not having the right app, not getting the right links. It was always about the links, not having the right links to get into the classes. So just constantly being kind of at a loss in that sense. And that also just not having anyone around him at home to sort of make sure he was plugged in and doing what he needed to be doing. And just, just a home in great constant turmoil as unfortunately many children of course face at home. And so he was just completely at a loss. And I kind of assumed going to the summer last year that the recognition of that problem would lead us sort of as a society to do everything we could to reopen in the fall. And actually the superintendent in Baltimore, Dr. Santelises, was very intent on reopening because she, knew just how many students there were like Shamar in Baltimore. And she was really pushing pretty hard and had all these plans for ventilation and whatnot. And then at some point in July, it became clear that she just didn't have the support of her teachers, and also that she was definitely going to face a challenge with at least some of the parents in town about bringing children back. And you're going to end up with the complications of sort of a hybrid model because a lot of parents were going to be choosing to stay home. But the teacher resistance was definitely large, and the teacher union resistance was a very large factor in her deciding that she was not going to be able to make it work to start the year. I do think that it's important that we we think about the broader context and point out that this was not just about teacher union resistance. There were other things going on that were making it tough to reopen, and that have led us to the point where we are today, which is, we have to be honest about the context here. The United States has had on average 52 weeks of school closure, 52. Other countries much lower, Germany 30, UK 27, France 11. So we've had far more weeks of closure. That's just a fact that has to be acknowledged, with all the costs that come with that. But there are other reasons for that, I believe, beyond the union resistance that is so often pointed to. There are the politics, the incredible polarization that I described in the piece, where you had this, as soon as Trump and Betsy DeVos came out hard in favor of reopening, you saw this huge polarization against that. That was a major factor, both with teachers and with parents. You had wildly differing levels of leadership at the state level. We all know that state leadership matters so much when it comes to education. And you had some governors deciding, both red and blue states, deciding that they were going to do everything they need to do to get toward reopening relatively quickly. And so in those states, you saw much wider levels of reopening. So state leadership mattered so much. You had what you had in heavily, you had the parental fear, the parental concerns about going back, which were such a big issue. But I want to be careful that I think sometimes we've let parental fear sort of stand as its own thing, that it was somehow just kind of came out of nowhere. The parental fear was linked, of course, to the teacher resistance. It was, parents were hearing from teachers about how worried they were about going back, about how risky the teachers and the unions thought it was to go back. So of course, parents were going to absorb those fears too. They weren't just absorbing those fears from the teachers, of course. They were also hearing them from the media. The media, as I talk about in the article, got some things wrong. There were moments, big stories like the famous story about the South Korea data that made it sound like older kids were incredibly contagious. Turned out to be a flawed study, but that story just got all over the place. Stories like that help to spread a lot of fear among parents as well. There was definitely, and then there was the general climate that you had in democratic heavy cities and towns where there was just definitely a higher estimation of COVID risk than in red and purple places. And so that this kind of was absorbed into the school, the discussion. So of course it was going to seem really scary to go back to school, to send your kids back to school, if you were in a place where everything else was really closed down and everyone had, masks outside. And if you're in that kind of climate, of course, it's going to seem really scary to send your kid back to school. That's understandable. And there was just a different climate in the blue places around COVID fear. But that brings me to another key thing that I think has been too often lost in these discussions. We so often focused on the places that did not open. There was so much of the discussion was, how can we reopen schools? What that missed was that there were all these places in the country that did open. Of course, the private and parochial schools in a lot of blue places. It was pretty stark to be here in Baltimore and have literally next door to my kid's K-8 school that was closed almost all year, have the private school open all year with the cars coming in for drop off. And that was pretty jarring to see. But of course, in many red and purple states, they did open to much greater degree. They decided to make it work. And there were reasons, one reason they did that, of course, was, again, different assessment of COVID risk, definitely lower levels of union power in states like Texas. But I think we do have to look at how those states fared, and the fact that they did, by and large, manage to make it work. When we think now about where we are today, I think we have to be honest about the fact that it's pretty striking that even now, post-vaccination, where all the adults in this country have been able to get vaccinated, the fact that we're still at 60% of students in Metro Washington, D.C., including the suburbs, still remote. Half of all students in the entire state of California, as of last month, still remote. The fact that we're still at that point suggests that there's something going on that needs to be reckoned with. That has now gone almost beyond pure calculations of COVID concerns, because we now have, thank God, teachers vaccinated, everyone able to get vaccinated. And And so those numbers need to be reckoned with. I'm just going to close quickly back with Shamar. Shamar, I went to see him last night. He could have gone back to school. Baltimore middle schools opened up a few weeks ago. He chose not to go back. He didn't even know he was able to go back. No one from school reached out to him to say, hey, we'd love to have you back. So he's not going back. Why would he go back? He doesn't have to get on the bus now. He can just play video games while he's doing his classes. No one in his family is scared about him going back. It's just inertia. No one is asked to bring him back. So he's still at home. He skips his first class every morning because he just can't wake up. He had trouble. He missed that class for 2 weeks because he didn't even have the link again. He lost the link again just recently. He always has his camera off. He always has his microphone off. I asked him once, do you ever talk in class? And he looked at me and he said, why would I talk? He said, no, I'm never unmuted, he said with a smile. He never leaves the home. This is a kid who used to run all over the jungle gym, just loved running all over the jungle gym, even though he was in middle school. He never leaves the home anymore. He seems startled. He seems startled that he even has to go back to school like next fall. He doesn't understand that he's going to have to go back to school. This is now his life shut inside his home.
Thank you, Alec. Saul Rubenstein.
Oh, I'm going to try to share my screen. I think I've done that okay, and I just have to turn it into presentation mode and I'll be good to go. No, yes?
Looks good.
But it's not yet in presentation mode. There you go. Good.
Okay, now it's in presentation mode. Okay, so I want to thank Steve for organizing this panel and inviting me to be on it. I'm really honored to be here with everyone and especially excited to appear again with Becky Pringle. I want to offer this afternoon an alternative story about responses to the pandemic. This one's about teachers' unions solving problems and adding tremendous value as partners with school boards and administrators. And the difference here is a collaborative model and partnerships that were already in place pre-pandemic. And so I'm going to start by talking briefly about research that has been underway for the past 12 years with my colleague, John McCarthy, and then turn to putting this into practice in New Jersey over the past 8 years with colleagues Charles Heckscher and Justin Vinton, who is here on this session. I'm not going to spend much time on the quantitative evidence on collaboration, performance, and poverty. I've done that before at these meetings, but rather I want to show you some early findings from a more qualitative story about the impact of collaboration on districts during the pandemic. And I'm going to give you the voices from leaders, union, administration, teachers in 6 districts across New Jersey, both urban and suburban. So when we talk about collaboration here, I'm going to briefly hit on student achievement, teacher retention and turnover, poverty, and then focus on the pandemic. And then I want to turn to the practice in New Jersey through the New Jersey Public School Labor Management Collaborative. So what do we mean by partnerships and collaboration? I'm defining this as district and school level faculty and union partnerships at the district level that empower educators to collaborate differently in school buildings, that allow them to share decision-making, problem-solving, goal alignment, and increased educator voice so that innovation comes from educators within districts and schools with a focus on teaching and learning. Why is it not letting me? Okay. Let me start with some national performance data that John McCarthy and I have been gathering for the past 8 years. Here we're looking at student performance at or above standard in English and in math, looking at the district partnership, the level of collaboration in school buildings. We're controlling here for poverty and school type. This reflects input from 5,000 educators, 25 districts, 450 schools across 6 states, urban, rural, and suburban schools. And what you see here in this graph is if you look at the level of collaboration in the buildings, from the lowest level in the lower left to the upper right, that line shows that even after holding poverty constant and holding all the other factors we could think of constant, you get an additional 12.5% of students testing at or above standard just based on the level of collaboration in the buildings. We found a similar finding, both statistically significant for math, though math is slightly less than English, but in both cases, collaboration in the building positively impacts student achievement. Here's turnover. We found that teachers in high poverty schools were leaving the profession at 3.5 times the level of teachers in wealthier schools. But if collaboration was strong, there was no statistically significant difference. In fact, the lines cross in the lower right. So that collaboration mitigates completely the negative impact of poverty on teacher turnover. Same thing happens when we look at commitment to the profession. Less commitment in high poverty schools, but if the school is highly collaborative, no difference in commitment. So just to summarize, and I'm happy to send people the details of these studies, these partnerships between teachers' unions and administration lead to more extensive collaboration between educators at the building level, and that collaboration improves student performance in both English and math, even after we control for poverty, and it reduces the negative impact of poverty on teacher turnover and increases engagement, with partnerships serving as institutional networks for problem solving, information sharing, and diffusing innovation. So 8 years ago, we shared these findings with the leadership of the teachers, New Jersey educators, the associations for administrators, NJASA, the NJEA, New Jersey Education Association, the NEA affiliate New Jersey, AFT New Jersey, the New Jersey School Boards Association, and the New Jersey Principals and Supervisors Association. And they were quite interested in these findings, and so we decided to turn research into practice. So these associations, the state level education associations, formed what they called the New Jersey Public School Labor Management Collaborative. We held statewide summits. Becky Pringle keynoted one of those. We had Governor Murphy keynoting another. At our last meeting, Secretary Cardona sent in a message by tape, and we've been doing that pretty regularly. We hold capacity building workshops for districts interested in developing more collaborative processes, structures, and institutions at the district and school level. We hold inter-district learning networks twice a year so that districts can help other districts. And we have tapped facilitators who are superintendents, school board members, union presidents, principals, and teachers from the early districts to serve as trainers and consultants in the newer districts that want to enter. And we continue to do research like this on what the impact is of this on teaching and learning. To date, we have 23 districts in our collaborative in New Jersey, 128 schools, 450 administrators, over 7,600 teachers who teach 77,000 students. We expect to add another 6 to 8 districts. We want to get to a period of 10, we want to get to a level, we think a critical mass of 10% of all New Jersey districts over the next 3 years. Now let's take a look at what this has done, these union management partnerships at the district level and the resultant collaboration at the building level. What have they resulted in over the past 18 months during the COVID pandemic? Joint planning of implementation of hybrid, in-person, and virtual instruction, adapting curriculum together, jointly designing and sharing instructional practice, coming up with social emotional learning and trauma-informed practices, building diversity, equity, and inclusion into curriculum, developing professional development on reopening, focusing on staff and student mental health, scheduling vaccinations for staff, K-12 articulation, cross-disciplinary integration, new teacher induction, textbook selection, new roles for paraprofessionals, clerks, and support staff, digging deep into student performance issues, developing together cleaning protocols, ventilation levels, temperature checks, new building schedules and calendars, focusing on facilities with new custodial responsibilities, introducing new remote technology for teaching, child study teams and special education focus, changes in leave policies for tenured and untenured faculty, negotiating new contracts during this period, accommodation for remote instruction, developing advisory periods, new course development and introductions, homework policies, exam coordination, mentoring, developing assessments during this period. Let me give you some quotes from some of the leaders in these 6 districts. This is from the superintendent in a district in the central west part of the state. The good news is we have strong collaborative structures in place that were formed over the last 7 years. These structures put us in a better position to handle the challenges of COVID or any other challenges that would come our way. We've been able to do all this within the pandemic because of these collaborative structures we have in place. I have leaned on and leveraged the structures that we have in place to navigate all the issues and obstacles that this epidemic has brought to all of us. This would never have been possible without the collaborative structure we have in place. We sit together with our school administrators and Board of Education subcommittee meetings with human resources, finance, curriculum, instruction, and policy. Having everyone in the room promotes understanding and consistency and leads us to the best decisions possible. Collaboration is the way we do business and has become part of our DNA. We've had bumps in the road and we'll experience more in the future, but the great results we've achieved far outweigh the rough patches we've had. When I speak to my fellow superintendents in the county, they can't believe the involvement we have with our teachers and administration in the decision-making process and are amazed at the positive relationships that I've forged with the unions, and most importantly, what we're able to tackle and achieve collaboratively. The union president in that district says the good news is we had strong collaborative structures in place that were formed over the past 7 years. These structures put us in a better position to handle the challenges of COVID or any other challenges that would come our way. I would attribute a good part of the success to teacher and association voices being represented at various meetings. COVID certainly presents plenty of opportunities to disagree. Collaboration means we work together towards a common goal. I can't stress enough how the organizational structures from teachers to supervisors to the school leadership team has helped us thrive in this time of unsettled craziness. We've built the capacity to handle changes in learning, assessing, and scheduling. It's become embedded in our culture. We hear the same kinds of messages from middle school principals.
We need to wrap it up, please.
Well, I'm sorry about that. Essentially, what this, if I had the time to finish, what we see are positive messages from all 6 districts, urban and rural and suburban, all saying that because of the structures that were already in place, they have been able to achieve responses to COVID, in-person, virtual, hybrid, with no learning loss and increased achievement by students across the board. If anybody's interested in more detail, I'm happy to send this out to people.
Thank you very much, Saul. So before we take questions, before I ask any questions, I wanted to ask Becky Pringle, Ana Maria Chavez, whether you wanted to respond to any of the other discussants. I thought Becky might want to respond somewhat to what Alex said. You're on mute. Becky, you're on mute.
Somebody had to do it. One of the things that I certainly appreciated, and it speaks to what Saul did, where Saul ended, Alec, is that you didn't stop at saying, you know, teachers unions were the obstructionists, and that's why. That you dug in deeper and realized that there were concerns with parents, there were differences among communities, there were other factors that were impacting. And so as I think about, you know, what we've done this year, and I've challenged, you know, whenever I get interviewed, when I get questions, one of the first things I feel like I have to do with every reporter that interviews me, Steve, I think I did it with you, I'm not sure. But I feel at some point in the interview, I have to like yell, we're in a pandemic. Whoever did that before? And so when we think about hindsight or, you know, what we have done differently, you know, as I said before, the science changing all the time. What we found to be true, where Saul ended, is that when we were collaborating together and we were learning together, when we all had the same information, we did better. We made better decisions. And those decisions resulted in not only navigating the chaos and the constant change getting more information and trying to make other decisions. But it also resulted in our students and our families being safe and healthy and learning continuing. You know, Alec, when you talked about Shamar, we all know Shamar, right? I mean, I thank you for mentoring him, and we do depend on people like you to help with students that need that additional support. But guess what? We knew about Shamar for decades. We've known about these inequities forever. What have we done about them? What I'm hopeful about, honestly, Steve, you know, with the investment from ARP, from the American Rescue Plan, proposed a budget, historic investments in public education, that we actually will be able to build those collaborative systems, build those community schools. I've been talking about that too. I think I talked to you about that too, Steve. When we went back and looked at our community schools, they fared so much better too, because they already had that support with partnerships with girls and boys clubs who were mentoring some students like Shamar. They were there making sure they were getting the links and doing those kinds of things when parents had to have 2 and 3 jobs. But they also didn't look at the community from that deficit model. They looked at their parents and communities as assets, and how can we build on those assets so we can do what we needed to do from the beginning for our students, all of us having that shared responsibility. So as we think about what's next, because guess what? We don't know what the fall is going to bring, but we do know this. Our students have great academic, social, and emotional needs. And if we don't think about how we're going to address that together, even post COVID, we will not have learned our lessons. We will not have taken this opportunity to do better. We will not, when we say all, we still will not mean all.
Thank you. Anna Maria, do you want to add anything?
You know, I do. And I think everybody, what they've commented on today clearly comes from different perspectives. I go back to a quote that I say quite a bit that my mother taught me. To those that much is given, much is required. What I've witnessed over this last year, and I started this role during the pandemic. I've yet to meet my staff. I've yet to meet my national board. I've yet to travel to these states. To Becky's point, this is a pandemic, a once in 100-year pandemic. And I think that, one, leadership is hard to begin with, but two, under this amount of pressure, what I've seen really move things forward is people having the vulnerability to say, I don't have all the answers. And for those elected officials that we serve and that we support, they've gained more traction on the issues that they voted on when they actually created virtual platforms to get feedback from their constituencies. And for many of them, they had never done this amount of community engagement in the entire history of their elected career as a school board member. Because again, pre-pandemic, they would open the school building and they would have their school board meeting, and some people would come on a Tuesday night if they could. All of a sudden, we have school boards who are having 22-hour school board meetings virtually, continuously for 22 hours, so that they could literally hear from thousands of parents and caregivers about the decision of reopening their school. So for me, I'm in the space of so much to learn. As leaders, we need to be also empathetic and compassionate that people have gone through so much stress during this past year, and that kids are watching. We're bringing that stress home. We're living this out. And at the end of the day, we've got to move past these partisan issues and address these underserved populations, to Becky's point, that have been in plain sight for generations. And as leaders, we have an obligation now to address those inequities.
Thank you. Members of the audience, if you have any questions, please write them in chat. I have a question. So we all know San Francisco, Chicago, there were huge tensions between the teachers' unions and the government, the greater community. There are other districts here in New York where relations between the government and the unions were much, much better. Now, I wanted to ask all of you, what enabled things to work very well in certain communities, and what caused others to be at each other's throats? What are the best ways to act, and what are the things to avoid?
So Steve, can I take a bite?
Go ahead.
No, go ahead, Becky.
No, go ahead, Saul.
Well, what we're seeing is that if those districts that already had in place strong partnerships between the school boards, the teachers unions, and the administration, they fared well. They figured out how to bring the voices of multiple stakeholders, the concerns, the differing concerns, and they had processes and structures and forums for figuring that out. Some of the districts in our collaborative were in person the whole year. Some were hybrid the whole year, but they figured it out together, and they figured out ways to solve problems for bringing quality education, whether it was in person, virtual, or hybrid. And it goes back to something that both Becky and Anna Marie said. I mean, both the union and the school boards are the anchors of democracy in this system. I mean, this is where you get democratically elected leaders from the community to serve on the board and from the teachers to represent them. And you need those voices. You don't have them in the private schools. You don't have them in the charter schools. And you need those voices in order to be able to come together in a way that builds trust and come up and create systems of quality to get through these kinds of pandemics.
Becky?
Yeah, Saul's absolutely correct. And yeah, we saw a lot of the contentious relationships or lack of relationships at all play out. And you folks in the media know that those stories are the ones that are told. You don't hear the countless stories of where it worked, and it worked all year long. And instead of digging into that, I mean, Alec pointed this out before, the politics in this, that playing out, doing such a disservice to our kids. And I think about how much further along we could have been, but it's what it is, right? And so one of the things I've been thinking about as NEA president is, I'm an educator, so I always engage in reflective practice, and that hasn't changed as president. And so, as I think back on the year and, what could I have done better? Or, as we go into this new year, what am I going to bring forward? What did I learn? What did we all learn collectively? And so one of the things that we learned was what Saul just laid out. And so what was it, Saul? Maybe a month or so ago, I announced that the NEA was making a huge investment in growing, scoping, and scaling what Saul described across the country, and partnered specifically with New Jersey because they're ahead of the curve, and with our affiliate in New Jersey. And we are actually scaling that across the country because we can't, we'll be post-pandemic at some point, but to the point that I was making before, it's existed forever. The only way we're going to address these inequities that are built into all of these systems is that we establish those practices, systems, and processes of authentic collaboration that are sustained beyond leaders. They've got to be, that has to be systemic too. We saw that playing out too, right? We saw headbutting among people. We've got to build it into systems so it goes beyond those people. And so we are investing at a huge level to try to scope and scale that across the country, because we already saw what happened in this pandemic. We've got to do better. All of us have to do better. And it's our shared responsibility to do just that.
A question for Anna Maria. Thank you. What were some of the most effective ways that school boards solicited feedback from their communities?
Great question. And we saw really a wide range of very creative ways of engaging community. Facebook was a huge part of streaming live these school board meetings. Many times school boards allowed people to post comments so that if you couldn't attend or even didn't have the time to watch the virtual school board meeting, you could pre-submit questions or comments about decisions. So we saw that across the country. In addition, we've also seen where feedback has been, well, you posted it in English, but if 25% of your school population is perhaps multilingual, are you going to post it in different languages? So some school districts have now taken the step of making sure that their messages are bilingual. So that's in some cases a new way of work. For us, again, we've just allowed, as the national organization, we've connected work-alike groups. So we've connected the communicators in our state association so they could share how they are communicating to their stakeholders state by state. In addition, I just want to add to the conversation about what we've seen this past year. We also cannot forget that the exact same time all of this was happening around COVID-19, we saw the social unrest happen across the country, right? So we had school board members not only having to decide the issues around remote learning, but also seeing protests in their communities, students rising up against social injustice, having for the first time in many cases, having to facilitate really tough conversations about race and inclusivity and equity. And so as a national organization, we actually launched a national initiative called DIRE, Dismantling Institutional Racism in Education, to actually help our school board members be facilitators and moderators in these very tough conversations. So again, I'll just add to it, it wasn't just the disease, it was also these other very important social issues we were addressing.
Thank you. We have about 5 more minutes, so we have a few more questions. One, is there any sense that this crisis will lead to greater willingness in states that have been more hostile to adequately fund public education, or will the old biases persist? Another question, is there any evidence of the collaborative partnerships leading to a softening of the polarization that we're more generally seeing in society? It will have 1 or 2 years before we hit a global inflection point in the pandemic. So might we view the continued shadow of the pandemic as a motivator for a national priority on partnerships and education? And I'm going to throw in one last question. I keep thinking of the 60-year-old teacher who, wants to be in a classroom, but is very worried if she goes back into the classroom, she's going to get COVID. And, there's all this pressure telling you, well, the kids are doing terribly with remote learning, but you're worried about risking your life by going into the classroom. What do we say to that person? So those are the 3 questions, and we have like 3-4 minutes to discuss them. Sorry.
Well, I'm glad to take a quick crack at the first one about public support, political support. Just to say very quickly that I really do wonder, and I talk about this in my article, my Baltimore article, about what this whole year is going to do for public support for public education. There are a lot of districts that, especially the districts that have stayed very, very closed even until now, even post-vaccination, where there is definitely a lot of, as we know, a lot of parental disgruntlement, disenchantment, pulling their kids out, but more generally just somehow losing a lot of faith and confidence in public education. And I just, as a very, very strong supporter of public education myself, my kids, everything, I do wonder how that's gonna play out. And I just want to say one last thing, which is that I meant to mention before with the costs of these elongated closures, which again are so striking. 60% of all kids in Metro DC still at home. One of the costs we have to reckon with is the fact that with high schools so closed in a lot of cities, the horrific rise we're seeing in violent crime around the country has included a huge rise in juvenile crime. There were 24 kids killed this year already in Philadelphia. 24 children have been killed in the city of Philadelphia this year. There were 6 children charged with murder in Prince George's County in the first month of this year. Just last week, a 16-year-old boy was killed in Washington, D.C. at noon on a Friday, noon on a school day. So just gonna leave that.
Becky, Anna Maria, 3 more minutes of answers, then we have to close shop. Okay.
I'll take the 60-year-old teacher question because I've had those conversations, Steve. And how I approach those conversations goes to everything I've said this afternoon and been saying all year. When educators are involved in making decisions, they not only own that decision, but they believe it. And the same is true with our parents too. We recently did a survey of our parents, with all that was in the media about, parents not being supportive of teachers anymore, and, that support slowly being eroded and all of those things. We did a survey and actually it had grown because they saw the teachers and their unions fighting for the safety of their kids. And so one of the things that we are really leaning into, as we're also concerned, Alec, no question, is we have to lead in saying our schools are safe. And not just that, we're actually involved in making them better. And we need you to be there with us. And so with both educators and parents, involving them in those decisions and having them do the walkthroughs with us to actually demonstrate that we've done something about the ventilation, which, by the way, so many people poo-poo that. Our schools haven't been safe for a very long time. We know that we have sick buildings. So this is not new. It's not just because of COVID. So the things that we're doing in our schools, we're really pushing and advocating for getting the money to change, to actually address the infrastructure of our schools. Having educators and parents involved in those decisions is one of the things that I applauded the secretary in doing in the guidance that he attached to the ESSER funds, the ARP funds going to the schools, is he said that you must include the voices of educators, education stakeholders, including parents and unions, in making the plans and implementing those plans. So when you talk to that 60-year-old teacher and you demonstrate that they're going to be part of actually developing those plans and implementing them, then they have the confidence that they need that our schools are safe, and we're going to do everything to keep them and our students safe and provide them the resources they need to do the jobs they love.
Last word to Anna Maria, if you want to add anything. Thank you, Becky.
I will add on a positive note. We've seen an uptick in certain school board races where for years they couldn't get candidates to run. And this year they're seeing an uptick in interest. So people have seen what's happened. They are now fully engaged in the discussion around public education in the United States. And they actually elected an 18-year-old young man in Texas to serve on a school board, the youngest ever. So again, I'm in it for the kids. I'm in it to make sure this future is great and strong. And I think working together collaboratively, as Sal would say, is the way to get things done.
So to my mind, this has been a terrific panel. I thank the four of you. I thank you, Becky. I thank you, Anna Maria. I thank you, Saul. I thank you, Alec. And I should also thank the people pulling the strings behind the scenes, Emily Smith and Bernadette Tiemann, who've done such a good job putting this all together. So thank you very much. Next year, I hope we could all meet in person and do it again. Just kidding, but thanks. Keep well. Keep up the good work, everyone. And thanks again so much.
Thanks, Steve. Thanks, everyone.